Rochester. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Husted, aye. Ms. Slotkin, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Fetterman, Mr. Fetterman, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Moreno, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kane, no. Miss Rosen, Miss Rosen, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Young, aye. Ms. Markowski, Aye. Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bennett. No.
Like a fine enough state.
Mr. Hawley, Mr. Hawley. Aye.
Okay. Yeas are 52, nays are 48. Nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered and laid upon the table, and the President will immediately notify of the Senate's actions.
Mr. President, I
Majority Leader.
move to waive the mandatory quorum with respect to the Kennedy nomination.
Is there objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. of California to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. A quorum is present. The question... Which one do? The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. of California to be Secretary of Health and Human Services shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso.
Aye. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Thank you. Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, thank you, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Ono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith. I did not, thank you. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane.
No, yes.
Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford. Thanks. Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Capito, Kramer, Curtis, Fisher, Haggerty, Hawley, Husted, Justice, Kennedy, Lee, McConnell, McCormick, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Scott of Florida, Sheehy, Thune, Tillis, and Tuberville. Ms. Collins, aye. Senators voting in the negative.
Thank you.
Also Brooks, Bennett, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Coons, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Hassan, Heinrich, Kane, Kim, Lujan, Reed, Rosen, Schatz, Shaheen, Slotkin, and Smith. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Ms. Duckworth, no. No. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Peters, no. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mrs. Britt, aye. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Kelly, no. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Thank you. Mr. Schumer, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Oh. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Ms. Hirono, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Department of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. of California to be Secretary.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon, sorry.
Mr. President, as we begin this discussion that is so important to America, I thought I would just mention the conversation I had recently with a couple of young medical students who came up to me and said, you know, we know you're interested in health care and have been involved in this, and I'm so appreciative of Senator Murray, who's going to pick up on the health care issue, an area where she has very substantial experience and expertise. And I thought these medical students summed up this debate, because they said, the way we see this Kennedy nomination, it's not just a vote for next week or even next year. This is a vote with enormous impact for decades, because Mr. Kennedy, according to these young students, these young medical students, has a long record of essentially being anti-science. And what we're going to do in our discussion of his nomination is go into that and other issues. And suffice it to say, during his confirmation hearings, and they've been in multiple committees now, he was given ample opportunity from members on both sides of the dais to clarify his views on science and vaccines and our nation's biggest federal health programs. And we're going to, in the hours ahead, touch on each of these and why Mr. Kennedy's failure to demonstrate a basic understanding of these important issues that impact America's health make him a uniquely unqualified nominee to become our nation's chief health care officer. And in beginning my remarks, Mr. President, I wanted to say that ever since my days with the Gray Panthers, I've always felt that health care is the most important issue. If you and your loved ones don't have your health, everything just goes by the board. So that just reinforces what these young medical students were saying about the decision we're going to make in future hours with respect to Mr. Kennedy. And I'm going to start with perhaps the most dangerous aspect of his long history, and that's his embrace and amplification of vaccine conspiracy theories. He's made a lucrative career out of sowing doubt in the minds of parents when it comes to vaccinating their kids. His, quote, nonprofit, the Children's Health Defense, is solely dedicated to peddling these conspiracies. You can even get merch. There are baby onesies, apparently, that read unvaxxed, unafraid, no vax, no problem. He's been the attorney of record on at least 5 cases against drug companies for their vaccines, which he didn't disclose to ethics officials and refused to answer questions about. He also refused to give up his 10% stake in any settlement agreements, instead passing them off to his son. And he refused to recuse himself from taking any actions that might affect his family's financial interest. A vaccine that has become routine for young people about 20 years ago was involved here, and since then it successfully cut cervical cancer rates into just a fraction of what they were before the drug came to market. All of this adds up to a future HHS secretary who stands to profit off undermining this vaccine and as a result raise cervical cancer rates. To quote my Republican colleague, Senator Cassidy, a physician, Mr. Kennedy is financially vested in finding fault with vaccines. He also played a big role in one of the most deadly measles outbreaks in recent history. In 2019, he traveled to Samoa and used his platform to promote his anti-vax agenda, taking aim at the measles vaccine. The vaccine rate in Samoa plummeted. By 2019, measles had torn through the population, making more than 5,700 people sick, and 80 people were killed, most of them young kids. During his confirmation hearing at the Senate Finance Committee, Mr. Kennedy told me, and I quote, "We don't know what was killing them," speaking about those 83 deaths. But just last week, the Director General of the Health of Samoa called this claim by Mr. Kennedy, and I quote here, "a total fabrication." So, Mr. President and colleagues, just put that in your thinking about this consideration. Mr. Kennedy saying that he didn't know what was killing these young people in Samoa, and the Director General of the Health of Samoa called Mr. Kennedy's claim a total fabrication. A recent analysis showed that Mr. Kennedy has made 114 separate appearances in the last 4 years where he took anti-vaccine views or spread misinformation about the efficacy of the vaccines, linked vaccines to autism. Instead of providing the committee with clarity or reassurances about his decades-long career peddling of vaccine conspiracies, what did Mr. Kennedy do? He dodged, he weaved, he bobbed, and gave no indication that as Health and Human Services Secretary, he would stand by settled science that surrounds vaccines. As HHS Secretary, Mr. Kennedy would have a huge amount of control over how vaccines are promoted and administered in our country. He could issue orders that discourage doctors from sharing information with parents and patients about life-saving vaccines. He could issue an order that discourages schools from talking about or even requiring vaccines. He could rubber stamp an executive order from Donald Trump that defunds the Centers for Disease Control, which is essentially the agency in charge of getting Americans up-to-date information about vaccines and when to get them. Just imagine about the danger of vaccines. Maybe you do a bit of research, and lo and behold, you find this is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, America's chief healthcare guy. You think to yourself, this guy must know what he's talking about. Maybe he's right when he's questioning if vaccines are safe and effective. So the seed of doubt on vaccines gets planted. nations. A few months later, you're taking them on a trip to Disneyland, say for spring break, where countless other parents like you have heard the same medical advice from the same person, and you too decided against vaccinating your kids. It only takes one of those kids carrying a deadly disease like measles for an outbreak to be. Your kid, sadly, is showing symptoms. What follows then is a slew of doctor's appointments, maybe even a stay in the hospital, sleepless nights, missed days of work and school, not to mention dread and fear for your child's very well-being. Meanwhile, countless other parents around the country that went on the same trip to Disneyland are now experiencing the same exact nightmare you are. Sowing the seed of doubt in the minds of just a few people can have massive consequences for communities across the country. And it is not hypothetical that sickened more than a dozen kids. The number of kindergartners showing up with an exemption for required vaccinations jumped to a record high last fall. The two facts. Now, Mr. Kennedy is fond of saying he's not making recommendations about whether parents should vaccinate their kids. He's just asking questions and giving people choices. That's a slippery tactic used by conspiracy theorists to dodge any real responsibility for their words and actions, and it's absurd coming from somebody who's about to be confirmed for a job that is entirely about making recommendations. Mr. Kennedy is also fond of saying that if somebody shows him the science to prove he's wrong, well, then he'll apologize and retract his statements. But when somebody does show him the science proves him wrong, he just brushes it aside and basically will not accept it as fact. Once again, to quote my Republican colleague Bill Cassidy directly, to improve the health of Americans or undermine it, always asking for more evidence and never accepting the evidence that's there. That's why Bill Cassidy told Mr. Kennedy he was struggling with his nomination. So even Republicans like Senator Cassidy, someone I work with frequently on the Finance Committee and respect his opinion, he knows how dangerous this guy is. And it is not hyperbole to say that when Mr. Kennedy, our government rolls out vaccines or make them available, I believe kids in America will die. And when disease rates for illnesses that have effective vaccines start to rise in states across the country, and hospitals are going to regret voting, if they do, for Mr. Kennedy today or early this morning. And when disease rates for illnesses that have effective vaccines start to rise in states across the country, and death tolls, mount, again, we will see Republicans say, this is something that could have been prevented. What else should we have done? Republicans will be responsible for every child that dies as a result of not being vaccinated, because it seems they care more about staying in the good graces of Donald Trump than they do about protecting the lives of kids. Again, this is something they will regret for years to come. Now, before we turn to Senator Murray's remarks, I'd just like to touch on Mr. Kennedy's stance on reproductive choice, an area where Senator Murray has been our leader for years and years in the Senate. In the lead up to and during his failed presidential campaign, Mr. Kennedy repeatedly claimed he supported a woman's right to make her own health care decisions. Less than a year ago, in an Instagram post on June 14th last year, he stated that he supports the emerging consensus in this country that abortion should be legal up to a certain number of weeks. Fast forward to his confirmation again at the Senate Finance Committee a few weeks ago. He was pressed repeatedly by Democrats about his stance on abortion. Instead of clarifying, Mr. Kennedy defaulted to a clearly rehearsed talking point that he repeated over and over again. Quote, I agree with President Trump. Every abortion is a tragedy. While that answer doesn't give us much clarity, it's certainly telling. Mr. Kennedy has a long history of changing his stance on health care issue after health care issue to whatever position benefits him at the moment, as long as it earns him power or it earns him a paycheck. As far as I can tell, Mr. Kennedy will believe, or at least pretend to believe, whatever you want him to. He's willing to give up his principles and all of his beliefs that women and mothers are better equipped to make their own health care decisions than politicians. And it's all about, as we've talked about on this floor, staying in Donald Trump's orbit of power. While Mr. Kennedy recites rehearsed talking points on the subject, this is an issue that has had real, deadly consequences for women, as Senator Murray has said again and again. Donald Trump spent his first term packing the Supreme Court with right-wing extremists willing to rip away the reproductive freedoms guaranteed to us under Roe versus Wade. In the wake of the Supreme Court's gutting Roe, millions of women living in red states have had their reproductive freedoms ripped away from them, all due to Donald Trump. In the years since the overturn of Roe, there have been countless headlines about the consequences of these abortion bans. Women bleeding out in parking lots or in emergency rooms because they were denied care. Women becoming infertile and losing their ability to have kids in the future because they couldn't get care. And in the very worst cases, women dying. So it should horrify every American that we don't actually know where Mr. Kennedy stands. The man who could become our nation's chief health care officer, we don't know where he stands on reproductive health, short of perhaps just saying he's a yes man for anything Donald Trump tells him to do. So I think at this point, Mr. President, I want to yield the floor to my friend and colleague from Washington State, because she knows so much about the challenge of ensuring that women's reproductive health services are being protected. And as Secretary of Health and Human Services, Mr. Kennedy could do so much damage to the well-being and health of women, and I'm very pleased to be able to yield the floor to her to discuss that and other pressing issues.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to my colleague from Oregon who has very clearly stated why this nominee is not someone who should be holding the title of Secretary of Health and Human Services, and I appreciate all of his work on this and his wise words. I hope everyone heeds them. Mr. President, the American people are watching now with alarm because the vast majority of people know vaccines are safe, they're effective, they are life-saving. But we are now on the verge of confirming as our nation's highest health official, a man who has spent considerable time, money, and effort, a man who has abused his platform by refusing to acknowledge the well-established science that shows that vaccines are not linked to autism. Fear about that point, fueled by RFK Jr. and others peddling misinformation, is a leading reason that parents do not get their kids vaccinated against preventable, dangerous diseases. That is why elevating a man like RFK Jr. to lead HHS would be so dangerous. Just giving him any platform to spread vaccine doubt is dangerous, but to give him one of the biggest megaphones in the world, it is truly shameful that we even are debating this. My colleagues should know better. They actually do know better. They are looking the other way. They are choosing to pretend like it is in any way believable that RFK Jr. won't use his new power to do exactly the thing he has been trying to do for decades, undermine vaccines. Never mind the fact that CDC has already modified web pages with information about vaccines and other vital public health information, which a federal judge has now ordered the Trump administration to restore it. Never mind that the Trump administration and across HHS. This is how RFK Jr. substitutes his own beliefs for science. So when the vaccine conspiracy starts swirling and RFK Jr. turns HHS into ground zero, what he did is not going to be an excuse for confirming him, because at the Health Committee hearing, the chair pressed him repeatedly about the debunked claim that vaccines cause autism. And when RFK Jr. said he needed to see the evidence, he was shown the evidence. But to no one's surprise, he did not keep his word. Autism. He's had 2 weeks since that hearing to look at the same settled science as everyone else. Crickets. But he won't hesitate to quote the latest anti-vax conspiracy. He's really buying this guy will take an impartial look at the science. If you think RFK Jr. will change who he is, you are lying to yourself. He has given no evidence to suggest that and all the evidence in the world to the contrary. Given his long and growing track record, we cannot just pretend if RFK Jr. finally gets power to undermine vaccines, a cause he has dedicated a considerable amount of time and effort to, that he'll just give up. That is not believable. And I know I've been talking a lot about vaccines because it is so obviously alarming. But the responsibility he would have goes far beyond that. So let's break some of this down. Both the ways he could undermine vaccines as HHS Secretary and the other responsibilities that would be at stake. To start with, the CDC is under HHS. That means that the Secretary directly appoints people to CDC's Vaccine Advisory Board. That board is responsible for making recommendations about vaccines, and it is those recommendations that determine whether or not changing those recommendations will change what vaccines millions of Americans, including kids, will be able to get from their healthcare provider. If he is confirmed, there would be nothing stopping RFK Jr. from firing the entire board and replacing them all with vaccine skeptics. After all, he has said many times and in many ways he thinks CDC is corrupt and bought by pharma, as usual, by the way, without any evidence. RFK Jr. would also oversee the Food and Drug Administration. That is another agency he has repeatedly tried to discredit and attack, where he says he plans to fire hundreds of scientists on day one, and an agency that plays the crucial role of making sure our drugs and our treatments, including vaccines, are safe and effective when we purchase them. Not only would Mr. Kennedy have a key perch from which he would undermine vaccines on a scale like never seen before, he could also use that platform to peddle quack treatments, no basis in science. RFK Jr. would also have jurisdiction over NIH. That alone means influence over billions of dollars in medical research that is responsible for a significant portion of our economy, and more importantly, research that patients are desperately hoping will help them find cures. But RFK Jr. could promising cures, or he could make good on his plan to fire hundreds of researchers and pause infectious disease research for 8 years. It should go without saying, viruses aren't going to take a break. And here's the thing, the attacks on medical research are now already happening under Trump. President Trump has already been threatening medical research. Suddenly, all of our grants are at risk because they are looking at addressing barriers to care or understanding why Black and Native American women have higher maternal death rates. And now President Trump also is trying to illegally, arbitrarily, and suddenly change NIH guidelines to set an unrealistic low cap on indirect cost rates. That will mean researchers laid off, studies canceled, including life-saving clinical trials, and kids not able to get the treatment they need. All because President Trump and Elon Musk don't seem to understand how we actually fund important research and couldn't even be bothered to find out before taking an axe to our medical research labs. At a time when life-saving research like this is already under attack from President and the richest man in the world, no one who truly values medical research should vote to install one of the biggest attackers of medical science as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Mr. President, insurance is another huge portfolio for HHS. Last time Trump was in office, we saw millions of people lose their health care coverage. The uninsured rate went up after years of hard-won progress. And we all know he still wants to rip up the Affordable Care Act, which will drive up costs and kick people off. There is no reason to think he has the experience and understanding of the system to actually do so. During his committee hearings, RFK Jr. confused Medicare and Medicaid. This is basic stuff. He failed to describe the components of Medicare. And yes, Mr. President, I do absolutely have to talk about abortion care. This is of grave importance right now. In his hearings, not only did RFK Jr. confess to having no real understanding of EMTALA. That is a law which requires patients have access to life-saving emergency care, including, in some cases, abortion care. He also showed that he will be totally open to Republicans' fact-free efforts to rip away access to medication abortion. Like so many other issues that RFK Jr. is simply wrong about, the science on that has been settled for many years now. A Republican argument against the science that basically boils down to nah. Putting up barriers to accessing the abortion pill or ripping it off the market completely, as Republicans have made very clear they want to do, would be absolutely devastating. And let's not forget about pandemic threats. The lies that RFK Jr. spread during the last already made clear he is not the man to do this job. But if that weren't enough, when there was a pandemic threat response planning session for this new administration, he skipped it. He didn't go. It would be almost comical if this wasn't so serious. Mr. President, everywhere you look, everything about this nominee is so concerning. We cannot take this man at his word. Something he has changed and gone back and forth on time and time again, but we can take him on his record, which is that he has consistently undermined vaccine confidence. And by the way, note, he profited from that. And we can take the threat of what he might do seriously, especially given the alarming things that are already happening. If RFK Jr. gives you his word of honor that he won't freeze research, guess what? We're already seeing the Trump administration totally upend medical research. Thanks to the Trump funding freeze, NIH hasn't issued any grants award in weeks. If RFK Jr. swears that he's not going to take down information about vaccines, he's not going to silence experts, well, don't look now. But the Trump administration has already taken down or changed CDC pages about vaccines. They have already silenced public health experts. If RFK Jr. pinky promises you that he won't undermine medical science or studies or he won't ignore global health threats, well, you might want to sit down for this, but President Trump has completely demolished our global health aid work. He has already completely demolished it. The fall she went to for oxygen was forced to discharge her because they got a stop work order from the Trump administration. It's not clear if she was the first death caused by Trump's complete freeze, but there is no question she will not be the last. And Mr. President, let me make a really important point here. It is not just people across the world who will be affected by this. There was a study being done on a new HIV treatment with thousands of volunteers. Study being done, already having 1,000 volunteers doing the treatment. But now, without their regular injections, which are cut off by Trump's move, there's going to be too little of the drug in their system to protect those people from HIV, but enough of the drug that if they contract HIV, it could mutate to become drug resistant. So for all the absolutely unhinged conspiracies we've heard about medical research from RFK Jr. and the like, where is the concern of this actual risk in this actual study happening right now, all because President Trump cut off foreign assistance? RFK Jr. has been silent about that risk, silent about how wrong that is. And so even as he is making these empty promises on one hand to some of our colleagues, he's already standing by as President Trump breaks them on the other hand. Oh, and here's one more. If RFK Jr. says he's going to consult you on healthcare personnel, please do not be fooled. Look, I don't know why my colleagues need me to tell them this. I like to think we have some pretty smart people around here. But this vote, RFK Jr.'s own nomination, this is your consultation on healthcare personnel, not some made-up promise for later. This is the point you have. You don't get to choose who RFK Jr. will appoint to this or that. Heck, he doesn't get to choose who President Trump appoints. The decision you get to make, all of us on this floor get to make, who you vote to confirm. And you will have to live with that decision. And if you ignore the warning signs and confirm RFK Jr., then when the wheels fall off the wagon, you may try to tell yourself you were lied to, but you knew who you were dealing with. You knew who you were dealing with. You knew what he said before and what he has refused to say. You had all the knowledge you needed to do the right thing. I cannot tell my colleagues enough. This is not a game. This is not a political role without consequence. The health secretary can get basic information and care that impacts whether they live or die. As I have tried to drive home throughout this process, vaccines save lives. That is not a question. It is not a slogan. It is a fact. If when parents look to you, worried about their newborn, wanting to do what is best for their baby, and trusting your advice as a public health leader, if you cannot tell them the same truth that centuries of science and experience tells us, which is that vaccines are safe and effective and life-saving, then you have absolutely no business leading the Department of Health and Human Services, none. And so just as I did at the hearing, I want to warn all of my colleagues, by merely voting to confirm Mr. Kennedy, we would be telling our constituents he's worth listening to on vaccines. That alone will get people killed before he even lifts a finger, because he does not even need the levers of power to get people killed. All he needs is that megaphone. To affirm his views by voting to confirm him as our highest health official, let's not mince words about what that will mean. When babies die from whooping cough because parents weren't sure if the vaccine was safe, will you be able to look them in the eye? When the flu sweeps our nursing homes, when measles sweep through our communities, will it be worth it? There are plenty of members who know perfectly well just how dangerous it would be to confirm RFK Jr. They don't need to hear it from me. In fact, some of them even know the danger better than I do. But here's what I do know. Conscience is a muscle. Courage is a muscle. The less you use them, the more they fade away. So if my colleagues are feeling the pressure from President Trump, or if they're feeling the weight of the richest man in the world on their backs on this vote, I would warn them. This will certainly not be the last test we face here in the Senate. Giving into this pressure now won't make it go away. It won't soften the pressure you face later, and it will not strengthen your resolve when the stakes are higher. It will just show pressure works. If you do not draw a line somewhere, you will cross every line you could ever imagine. You will be pushed further and further into accepting things you thought you never would, things you thought you never could. I think most of my colleagues know what really is at stake here. I think most of my colleagues know what sort of man RFK Jr. is and what sort of damage he could do if he's confirmed. There are political realities. We all get that. But there is also right and wrong. There's fact and fiction. There's people staying healthy and people dying pointlessly, kids dying pointlessly from diseases that we can prevent because they thought Congress took its job vetting our health care secretary seriously. So, Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to show some courage. I urge them to show some conscience. I urge them to vote no on RFK Jr.'s nomination. Mr. President, I yield 30 minutes of post-cloture debate time to the Democratic leader, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. I find it so interesting how people are watching so closely to see what this administration does. And I've been so pleased to see that the polling shows by an overwhelming amount 70% of the American people agree with how President Donald Trump is carrying out his job, getting things done for the American people, things that they voted to see done. And he is keeping those promises. Now, when we look at the issue of illegal immigration, we see that in his first weeks back in office, what he has done at the top of his to-do list has been to take action to secure this border. The numbers that we are seeing, how they have dropped with the number of encounters, with the number of gotaways, this is encouraging. The message is out there. The U.S. is going to protect and defend its sovereignty. We are going to protect and defend our people. That is important, and we are seeing it. Now, the president has taken some executive actions that have yielded results. By executive order, he restored the Remain in Mexico policy. By the way, Mr. President, this is something the Border Patrol has told us not for just a few years, but for decades. We need a border wall. That's where the phrase, build the wall, came from. It came from people that are down there every day protecting this country from harm. The president has also ended catch and release. Now, that's that practice where somebody comes across and then they get their paper that they're claiming asylum, and they're told that they can go on into the country and go wherever, and there are nonprofits down there on the border, and they give them a plane ticket and food and a phone, and off they go to their desired destination at taxpayer expense. So that has ended. The president has also sent troops to the southern border, and thank goodness we are seeing these deportations of criminal illegal aliens taking place. Yesterday in Nashville, we had eight. Two of them were linked to Tren de Agua. They were Tren de Agua gang members. Now, these are all things that the president is doing to make this country safe. And we have security moms all across this country, and certainly across Tennessee, that are reaching out to us and saying, keep it going. Deport those that are criminally in this country. Let's carry this out. We're seeing such good results. In operations across the country, ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has arrested 11,000 criminal illegal aliens, including many violent offenders and gang members. Since Inauguration Day, migrant encounters at the southern border we are seeing results. We know that for years, former President Biden allowed more than 10 million illegal aliens to enter the country, including tens of thousands of convicted criminals and more than 1.7 million known gotaways. And for 4 years, Tennesseans and Americans across the country have suffered the tragic consequences, including rampant migrant crime. Recently, our Tennessee District Attorneys General Conference released a report documenting the widespread migrant crime in our state during the final months of the Biden administration. Now, the state was a border state. So our Tennessee District Attorneys General took the last 3 months of 2024 and they said, let's look at what is happening in these last 3 months and see how this has escalated. Now, of course, we know that under Joe Biden, violent crime rose 43% his first year that he was in office. And what we saw from the District Attorney General's report, that there were in 3 months, now charged or convicted of 3,854 offenses in the state of Tennessee. Among them, the most common offense was driving under the influence. There were 654 arrests of those illegally in the country driving under the influence. These offenses accounted for more than 13% of all DUI arrests across the entire state. And this problem is a big reason why last year my Republican colleagues and I introduced the Protect Our Communities from DUIs Act. This bill would automatically deport any illegal alien who is charged with driving under the influence. Mr. President, as I have gone across our state, in each of our 95 counties, which I visit every year, into each of these counties, I have heard from law enforcement, from police chiefs, from sheriffs, that these DUIs are such an incredible problem, and the number that are committed by those illegally in the country. Now, over this same 3-month period, illegal aliens committed hundreds of violent, heinous crimes, 154 instances of domestic assault, 80 of aggravated assault, 21 convicted of child abuse, 9 of statutory rape, 8 of sexual exploitation of a minor, 7 of vehicular homicide, 4 of murder, 3 of rape of a child, and the list goes on and on. As I said, over 2,700 illegally in the country that were convicted, 800 crimes. Disturbingly, these numbers are likely an undercount. Only 73 of Tennessee's 95 counties reported data to the District Attorneys General Conference. Under Biden, national data showed that illegal aliens were pouring in from countries all over the world. And the Tennessee Migrant Crime Report also reflects this. There were 92 unique countries of origin from Mexico and Guatemala, Jamaica, Romania. Here's the bottom line. Because of Joe Biden's open border policy that was supported by far too many of my Democratic colleagues, thousands of crimes were committed by thousands of criminal illegal aliens in the state of Tennessee over just a 3-month span. And this, my colleagues, is just one state. This is my state. But we know this is happening in communities all across this country. More than anything, the report underscores the importance of President Trump's mass deportations, which are underway. There are many ways that Congress can support these efforts. My CLEAR Act, which I've talked about many times on the floor, would ensure state and local law enforcement officials have the tools to help the federal government deport criminal illegal aliens. This is crucial, especially when you've got far-left leaders like the Chicago mayor refusing to turn over criminal illegal aliens to federal custody. Now, General Bondi is suing these sanctuary cities for allowing criminal illegal aliens who have no right to be in our great nation to harm Americans. And thank goodness she is being tough on crime. I've also introduced the Preventing Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act, which would allow the deportation of illegal aliens convicted of sexual offenses or domestic violence. Any illegal alien who commits these heinous crimes should be removed from the country immediately, and I encourage all of my colleagues on each side of the aisle, support this. And my Container Act would ensure that border states like Texas have the legal authority to place temporary barriers on federal land to help stop the flow of traffickers, drugs, and criminals coming across the border. There are thousands of criminal illegal aliens residing in Tennessee and across the country. We should be using every resource at our disposal to remove them from our country. In many ways, the bills that I've mentioned would help President Trump to get the job done. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Hawaii.
it is not often that the stakes of a vote to confirm a cabinet nominee are this high. But tomorrow, when we vote on the nomination of RFK Jr. to be the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, the stakes will be life and death. Mr. Kennedy, in his words, but more importantly in his actions, has proven over and over again that he is a unique danger to society. But he's on the edge of becoming the country's top health leader with the power to unleash bygone diseases and undermine trust in science for generations to come. For the first time ever, we will have a health secretary who has actively helped to cause outbreaks instead of to contain them. We'll have someone in charge of medical research who's taken every opportunity to undermine science instead of promoting it. We'll have cause of mass shootings or chemicals in the water are turning children gay. This is the Secretary of the Health and Human Services Department. Those two things right there should be immediately disqualifying. This should be 100-0. This guy used to be a Democrat. This guy was pro-choice. This guy was for clean energy. This shouldn't be a partisan issue except to say, for HHS, you need somebody who has devoted their life and hopefully has some expertise in the area of public health. And it's not just that we didn't get someone who has expertise in public health. We have someone who has caused disease and death. And I say those words with precision. I understand that both sides of the aisle are prone to exaggerating their case and being apocalyptic when we describe a pending vote. I've been here for a while, and everything is always the most important vote that we will ever cast. And I don't know if this is the most important vote we'll ever cast. I do think, gosh, I hope I'm wrong. I really do hope I'm wrong. But I do think this is likely the cabinet secretary vote that is likely to age the most poorly, because this person has the potential to actually cause diseases like rubella, like mumps, like measles, like polio, that have been gone for many generations because we have a vaccine regime. And I want to tell you what he did in Samoa. In 2019, he flew to Samoa to discourage people from taking the measles vaccine. And the reason was that he wanted to run a, quote, natural experiment to see how people would fare against the disease without protections. Now, some of you may know this. My father was the first whistleblower against the Tuskegee experiments, in which the United States Public Health Service did a similar thing. They knew that penicillin cured syphilis, and they knew that for the most part, untreated syphilis caused death. But the U.S. Public Health Service decided to and be safe and be cured, and another cohort would receive a placebo and not get the life-saving cure for syphilis. And why did they do that? To, quote, observe the disease process. To observe the disease process. So when you investigate whether or not a medicine works, there's a whole process to it, right? The FDA, double-blind studies, all the rest of it. But the basic idea is you're trying to get to some level of reliability and statistical significance so that you can project out into the population what's going to work and what's not. Now, the sick in the head way to do this is to say you can't achieve statistical significance until you just let a bunch of people get sick and figure out what happens. The United States Congress, led by someone with whom I served for a couple of years, Tom Harkin, when they found out about the Tuskegee experiments, made a law against the U.S. Public Health Service ever doing that again because it's immoral. It's bad science, sure. But more than that, it treated these African-American men as if human beings in the United States were expendable for scientific research purposes, and that's exactly what happened in Samoa. That is exactly what happened in Samoa. 6,000 people got the measles. 83 people died. 79 of them were kids. It is so chilling to contemplate the idea that someone as recognizable as a Kennedy would fly across an ocean to a small developing country and basically tell everybody, be afraid of this life-saving medicine. And it's not like he did that once and said, I'm sorry, I misunderstood, or I'm being misunderstood. This dude actually sells onesies on his website saying, I think it's like unvaxxed and unafraid, for a little baby. This guy has views that are out of the mainstream of, I would guess, 99 state senators. And I do understand the pressure that some of my colleagues are facing. They're being told, if you vote against one Trump nominee, you will be primaried. So that's not a small amount of pressure. But this one, I just promise you, it's not going to age well. Some of my colleagues are expressing reservations in private. And I think that's better than not expressing any reservations at all. And some of them are getting private assurances from Mr. Kennedy that he does not, in fact, hate all vaccines. He just wants to answer questions and all the rest of it. I am not reassured. I think this person has demonstrated over a pretty long career that he says whatever is convenient in the moment, right? This is like an unreconstructed, he's a Kennedy. He was running for president in the Democratic primary, and now he's, right? Like there's just no way to go from over here to over here politically in such a short period of time, except that he was offered something, and he was offered this job. And why does he want this job? Because he's got a very specific view about public health. And I just want to make one other point. The problem of our food system, right? The problem of the extent to which we subsidize ultra-processed foods that are coming from commodities that are subsidized in the Farm Bill and causing people to get increasingly diabetic and all the related health problems that happen related to that. Like, that's a really legitimate place to do some good bipartisan work. And I would love to do that. It's also not what the HHS secretary does. It's what the United States Department of Agriculture does for the most part. And it's what the Congress does. The problem is the Farm Bill. The problem is you get what you subsidize. And we are subsidizing all the corn products and all the soy products and all the sugar products that go into the lab-tested, extra delicious, extra bad for you, extra addictive stuff that is making us all, even though we're the wealthiest country in human history, a very unhealthy country. And so if that's all this guy we're working on, you can count me in. But if your idea of public health has to do with healthy food, has to do with prevention, has to do with understanding that our food system and our agricultural system and our USDA and our Farm Bill process is essentially broken, you don't actually have to purchase this kind of crazy, evil stuff. You just don't. You don't have to do it. There's lots of good people on the food system side you can work with, work for, cheer on, organize with. But this man is going around, he's not talking about the COVID vaccine. He's not talking about whether or not it's appropriate to require masks in public, where Democrats and Republicans are like still arguing about stuff like that. He's talking about stuff that, like, if you're a parent and now you don't know whether when your kid goes to school, they've reached herd immunity for stuff that is like way generations back in the rearview mirror. And so I don't know if this is going to mark one of the most important public health moments in American history, but I can't think of another time where we actually have the technology, we have the medicine, we have the science, we have the distribution system, we have the public infrastructure to keep people safe. And we just decide by a vote of 53 to 47 to make people unsafe. So Secretary of Defense, DNI, all these are important. Treasury, every cabinet position is important. It's going to be a little more challenging to know whether your vote is vindicated in the sweep of history. I think this guy is going to age very poorly in the job, because I think we are going to see bad public health outcomes very shortly. This really is a matter of life and death. And I understand. What I have learned over the last 10 days is if Republicans are going to display courage, it's not going to be on the cabinet. There are a few that have voted, not with their party, but for the most part, like, they're in line and Trump is going to get his cabinet. But let this be a marker for everybody. Let today be a marker for everybody. Even if you voted for Trump, if you didn't vote for Trump, if you're not a voter, it doesn't matter. If you think it's a good idea to leave all of these diseases in the rearview mirror, then this is a very bad person to have running the Department of Health and Human Services. I yield the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity. 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to question Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the president's nominee to serve as the Health and Human Services, to serve as the Secretary of Health and Human Service. I asked Mr. Kennedy Jr. a simple question. What different vaccine schedule would you say I should have received? I asked this question because just 3 years ago, Kennedy said, and I quote, "We should not be giving black people." I asked him this question. Mr. Kennedy referenced a study by Poland, a study he assured me, and not just me, but also my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and the American people watching, that this study asserted that indeed certain races required a different vaccine schedule. That was a lie. In fact, the study's own authors stated the data doesn't support a change in vaccine schedule based on race. Mr. Kennedy's response was damning, and his response was dangerous. And so I followed up following the hearing with a letter and with questions. I wrote to Mr. Kennedy. During your testimony, you cited a series of Poland studies that underlie your claims that black people and white people should have different vaccine schedules. You ended by saying, in that hearing, you don't believe the science, the peer-reviewed studies? Well, Mr. Kennedy, I do believe in science, and I did some digging into the studies you referenced. NPR interviewed the authors of the studies you cited, medical experts with years of experience, and they universally disagreed with your assertions. In fact, Dr. Richard Kennedy of the Mayo Clinic, who was involved in a study you mentioned, made clear that the data doesn't support a change in vaccine schedule based on race. Dr. Kennedy also stated that your suggestion would be, quote, twisting the data far beyond what the studies actually demonstrate. Dr. Gregory Poland, who you mentioned by name during the hearing as doing research supportive of your claim, told NPR that his team, quote, found no evidence of increased vaccine side effects and that any claim of increased vulnerability among African Americans who received the rubella vaccine is, quote, simply not supported by either this study or the science. NPR quoted Dr. Carlos Del Rio of Emory University as saying that your conclusion was, quote, taking it to a very unsafe place because Black children already have lower vaccination rates than their peers. That is why claims on this issue were dangerous. I have to ask you, Mr. Kennedy, do you still believe that Black and white individuals should have different vaccination schedules? Now, you should think that the man who wants to serve as the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the man who wants to be tasked with the mission of HHS, which is improving the health, safety, and well-being of America, would provide a thoughtful and nuanced response. It was anything but. Because let's be clear, Mr. Kennedy is not a doctor, he is not a scientist. In fact, his only tangential connection to the world of health and science is decades-long activism questioning the efficacy and safety of vaccines. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised at his curt and dismissive response. Mr. Kennedy wrote, "If confirmed, I will do nothing as HHS Secretary that makes it difficult or discourages people from taking the vaccines, but instead seek transparency in these products." Yet another lie. Mr. Kennedy's life story is one riddled with quackery and laden with conspiracy theories. I quote him, "The childhood vaccines have ever been studied." He also said, I quote, "They get the shot, that night they have a fever of 103, they go to sleep, and 3 months later their brain is gone. This is a Holocaust, what this country is doing." I quote, "Autism comes from vaccines. The polio vaccine given to his generation caused cancer that," I quote, "that killed many, 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 many more people than polio ever did. The COVID vaccine was," and he said, quote, "the deadliest ever made." He also said, I quote, "COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasians and Black people. The people who are most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese." He also said, "There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective." All statements made by a man who is asking to be held responsible for a singular mission. The mission of the United States Department of Health and Human Services is to enhance the health and well-being of all Americans by providing for effective health and human services and by fostering sound, sustained advances in the sciences underlying medicine, public health, and social services. It is a task of epic responsibility, a serious job that, when done well, can save hundreds of thousands of lives. A job that, when done poorly, lives. And let us not speak of Mr. Kennedy in a vacuum. We have now held the floor multiple times over the past week over a string of nominees that are dangerous to the American people. Not because, and I cannot stress this enough, we disagree with their politics or their worldview. We can have robust policy debate. We can have robust scientific debate. In fact, robust debate has the potential to move us forward as a country. Respectful debate is the hallmark of this body. It is a crucial component of free speech. I went to law school, and I spent years in the courtroom trying cases, making my arguments before a jury of my peers, grounding my arguments for a basic set of evidentiary facts. But what we are dealing with here isn't a debate. It's a popularity contest. Nominee for Secretary of Health and Human Services because of his vast experience in medicine. Mr. Kennedy is not in this position today because of his deep scientific knowledge. Mr. Kennedy is not in this position today because he has respect for the scientific method. Mr. Kennedy is not in this position today because he respects medicine. Mr. Kennedy, like many of his fellow nominees, is in this position today because of his deep loyalty to the President of the United States. What makes our job increasingly difficult as members of the U.S. Senate is that we have the duty to advise and consent. And it isn't just a privilege of this chamber, it's a responsibility to speak for the people of our state as well as the American people as we evaluate the qualifications, the experience, and the temperament of a president's cabinet nominees. What is happening on the part of my Republican colleagues is not advice and consent. The sole qualification being assessed is loyalty. Not loyalty to country, not loyalty to the American people, not loyalty to the duties and responsibilities we have been entrusted with by the voters in each of our states. The sole qualification up for assessment is loyalty to the president. And Mr. Kennedy has that in spades. But loyalty to this president comes at a cost. Not a cost to the billionaires, not a cost to the people in this body, a cost to the American people. Democratic Americans, Republican Americans, independent Americans, Americans who voted for this president, Americans who did not, and Americans who did not vote at all. The president has been consistent that he believes the American people delivered him a mandate to carry out his agenda. With respect to the health, safety, and well-being of America, the purview of Health and Human Services, the president believes that cutting funds for medical research into things like cures for cancer is apparently a part of that mandate. Just this weekend, the president announced massive cuts to NIH, an agency which I'm proud to say has its home in Maryland. The mission of the National Institutes of Health is to seek fundamental knowledge about the nature and behavior of living systems and the application of that knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, and reduce illness and disability. It falls under the very agency Mr. Kennedy is seeking to run. Here are what some scientists, people I implored Mr. Kennedy to listen to despite his apparent distaste for the profession, had to say about these massive cuts. Dr. Richard Huganier, professor and chairman of the Department of Neuroscience at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in my state of Maryland, said, and I quote, "We were all just dumbstruck. I'm calling it the apocalypse of American science. This will basically change science as we know it in the United States. The bottom line is that we are going to have a lot less resources, which obviously means we are going to have to lay people off and research will be slowed down." At the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and the Bloomberg School of Public Policy said, and I quote, "We're going to see health research kneecapped." Dr. Brawley has actually overseen grants at the National Cancer Institute, which is a part of the NIH, as well as received them from his cancer research. He went on to say, and I quote, "People who are getting treated in clinical trials now for cancer will find many of those trials will close down." Dr. David J. Skorton, president of the Association of American Medical Colleges, said, and I quote, "These are real consequences. Longer waits for cures and progress, losing out to competitors around the world, and fewer jobs. Those who are facing any health challenges will suffer from less biomedical research." Dr. Robert Lefkowitz, a Duke University professor, my alma mater, go Blue Devils, professor of medicine who won the Nobel Peace Prize in Chemistry in 2012, said, and I quote, "I think the American people need to understand how devastating it would be if this goes through. A lot of research would just have to stop." Supports over 600 current and ongoing clinical trials at Johns Hopkins in Maryland. The NIH supports hundreds more critical research projects and clinical trials at the University of Maryland. Clinical trials in cancer, pediatrics and children's health, heart and vascular studies, and the aging brain. Research on traumatic brain injury to members of the military, suicide prevention, addiction, and patient safety. Clinical trials supporting over 23,000 jobs and $5.7 billion in economic activity in Maryland. These massive cuts will lead to over $200 million in losses to Hopkins and over $50 million in losses to the University of Maryland. Now, I may not be a Republican voter, but I can assure you Republicans across our country aren't seeking to stymie progress on a cure for cancer. By putting the NIH in its crosshairs, the president is targeting some of the most vulnerable Americans. The young child suffering from sickle cell disease, the working mom who's also struggling to care for a parent with Alzheimer's, the family member suffering from an opioid addiction, the father dying of lung cancer, all diseases being actively researched by the NIH. Disease and suffering does not respect the boundary of partisan politics. It impacts each and every American family. And it falls in part to the Secretary of Health and Human Services to do everything in his power to get us closer to cures. Instead, I fear we have a nominee before us who is more interested in getting us closer to conspiracies. And with loyalty to the man in the White House, as opposed to the health and well-being of the American public, Mr. Kennedy is likely to follow his boss in supporting a tax on Medicaid. This administration and my Republican colleagues are seeking to upend federal Medicaid financing and are considering per capita caps and repealing Medicaid expansion funding. Let me make this simple. The Republican framework to cut Medicaid puts nearly 435,000 Marylanders at risk of losing coverage. It will lead to major gaps in health care coverage and undermine family economic security. It will put quality care out of reach for more families. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, these are Democratic families. These are Republican families. That shouldn't matter to the president or the nominee for the Department of Health and Human Services. All that should matter is that these are proud American families. The administration's attacks on Medicaid would kick millions of people off their health coverage and force states to make deep cuts to benefits, eligibility, and reimbursement rates. My state can't afford these cuts. Maryland's families can't afford these cuts. 96% of eligible children in Maryland are supported by Medicaid and/or CHIP. Cuts would disproportionately hurt children with the lowest incomes and the highest health care needs. At a time when Americans are struggling under the weight of inflation, scraping to pay for food, gas, and housing, we cannot strip away or cut their health coverage. That's a cruel move that will certainly bankrupt many individuals and families. Many Americans are one catastrophe away from financial ruin. And if you take away their coverage and access to affordable care, it will be realized. Don't just take it from me. Marylanders have been calling and writing in, demanding that Congress do everything it can to fight against attacks to Medicaid. Jacqueline from Baltimore shared this with us. One day I was at work and passed out in the bathroom. Had to be cut out of the restroom by the firemen. After being in a coma for 12 days, it was determined that I was diabetic. Having Medicaid saved my life. If I did not have Medicaid or any insurance, I would have been sent home and who knows what would have happened. Another constituent from Ellicott City shared this. My 22-year-old son has autism and a significant cognitive disability. He is a happy, affectionate person who loves being around people and being physically active. Due to behavioral challenges at home, he lives in a group home. This environment is one in which he can be safe and thrive. He also attends a program licensed by the state's Developmental Disability Administration Monday through Fridays, 9 to 3. This program provides meaningful day services. Both his group home and day program services are funded through DDA's Medicaid waiver. Given the cost of my son's services and the services of many other individuals with developmental disabilities, a limit on federal Medicaid dollars would no doubt force Maryland to reduce services. If my son was not able to continue living in his group home, he would have become homeless. Another impact of Medicaid cuts could be his health care, as he is fully reliant upon Medicaid for his health insurance. He will never be able to work enough hours to draw health insurance benefits due to his disability. Such an anecdote should stir all of us to action. It should stir the members of this body to take more seriously our duty to advise and consent, to push back against the nominee who sees his role as a loyal foot soldier to one American who sits in the White House and not the millions of Americans whose health and health care are on the line. Last week, I looked Mr. Kennedy in the eye and said I would not be supporting his nomination. I said that his views are so dangerous to our state and to our country that his voice would be a voice that parents would listen to. I honored my constitutional duty of advice and consent. On behalf of every single Marylander who's lost a loved one to disease, every single Marylander who works at NIH or is actively researching cures, every single Marylander who has been led astray by a snake oil salesman peddling quackery instead of science, I will be voting no on Mr. Kennedy for them. And to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I urge you to think long and hard about the phrase that you believe encapsulates your mandate, America First. If we are not putting the people of this country first, then we are most certainly not putting this country first. America First cannot exist if the people in this country are too sick to be strong. And when you have someone like Mr. Kennedy responsible for the health of our citizenry, I fear that it is where we are headed, dead last, literally and figuratively. I may not be able to stop this nominee from being confirmed, but I want every Marylander to know that I will never stop fighting for your health and for the health of your loved ones. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I come to the floor to join my colleagues with a great deal of concern to discuss the Trump administration's nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. to be the next Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. To put it very simply at the outset, Robert F. Kennedy, RFK, Jr., is unfit to lead the highest health office in our nation. First of all, RFK has no, let me repeat, no health or medical experience. That in and of itself should be a red flag on this nominee who is supposed to be tasked with leading our nation's health agency. But sadly, that's not where the red flags end. From his radical and dangerous opinions on vaccines and other public health, to his promises to cut medical research, to his ever-changing position on women's rights to access reproductive health care, he has proven that he lacks the credibility, the knowledge, and the capability to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So let's take a step back. When President Trump ran his campaign, he ran a campaign on lowering costs for working Americans. Well, it's over 3% now. And we've seen nothing from President Trump's first weeks in office that addresses the high costs of health care, of food, of housing, of child care. 2 weeks ago, this administration, including the Health and Human Services Agency, halted funding across the board for programs like our community health centers and substance use treatment programs. These centers are often the main source of health care for their communities. They serve the people across the states of this country. In our office, I heard from programs like Coos County Family Health, a community health center that provides life-saving care to rural patients across the northern part of New Hampshire, what we call the North Country.
Their programs for training new doctors and providing services for victims of domestic violence were and still are at risk thanks to Trump's executive orders and funding freeze. And I heard from Navigating Recovery in Laconia. That's a substance use treatment service that depends on federal funding for more than 50% of its budget. They're worried about keeping their doors open. And this is an organization with providers who will literally sit with a patient by their hospital bed following an overdose to make sure the best guidance, the best treatment, and the follow-on services like housing and child care that allows them to start their recovery. And this is a real issue for us in New Hampshire, where we've been hit very hard by the opioid epidemic. The Trump executive orders and funding cuts will force Navigating Recovery to lay off staff and to curtail services should those funding cuts continue. These are actions on the part of the White House that don't lower costs for families. They do just the opposite. They put people out of work and they weaken our ability to care for our most vulnerable populations. But when he was asked if he would reverse this policy of cutting funding for programs like substance use recovery, RFK refused. The thing is, we should be taking steps right now to lower costs for families and children. Half of the uninsured Granite Staters cite cost as their New Hampshire have delayed care, and another 25% have delayed buying needed prescriptions or said they have to ration their meds. We could help these people right now. We could pass the Health Care Affordability Act, which would make permanent premium tax credits in the Affordable Care Act that have cut health care costs for 24 million Americans, nearly 70,000 from New Hampshire. Passing that bill would directly help constituents like the man in Newmarket who contacted our office. He's 55 years old. He's a patient at Lamprey Health Care, which is a community health center. He had been uninsured and avoided going to a doctor his whole life for 10 days because of complications from untreated diabetes. He had sepsis and he had an infection in his foot. Unfortunately, he didn't have insurance when he was hospitalized. But luckily, Lamprey Healthcare sat with him, helped him purchase insurance on healthcare.gov, helped him avoid potentially devastating medical debt. These tax credits are vital to his and to millions of Americans' ability to afford health care. But again, when asked about these tax credits, RFK refused to say that he would support extending them. So much for any concern about lowering costs for families. Now, if this administration is not trying to lower costs, what are they doing to help the people they swore an oath to serve? Last Friday, our research institutions got a notification almost overnight that their funding through the National Institutes of Health, would be gutted to find cures for diseases, to get ahead of public health crises, and to hire and retain talent. I think it was made rashly and irresponsibly without really understanding what the impact would be. Slashing those funds won't make research more efficient. Instead, it's going to cripple our ability to treat and cure horrific diseases. Dartmouth College, which is in Hanover, New Hampshire, is one of our preeminent research institutions in the country. Last year, Dartmouth received nearly $100 million in NIH diseases like diabetes, cystic fibrosis, and Alzheimer's. This NIH decision, this decision by the Trump administration, will cut Dartmouth's funding by $38 million. And we don't know what the future impact of that would be. Will we miss the next cure for a pediatric cancer? Will we fail to advance treatments in Alzheimer's? What we do know is that this has an immediate impact on the people living in the Upper Valley of New Hampshire. More than 1,300 employees are supported by federal grants at Dartmouth, and the vast majority of these are supported by the National Institutes of Health. The job loss, the economic impact that will result is devastating. And sadly, once these jobs are gone and the researchers leave, there's no going back because they're going someplace else. They're going overseas. But we unfortunately know that RFK supports this decision because he has publicly supported gutting NIH staff and research. And if Robert Kennedy is confirmed, I fear he will do nothing to push back or to reverse these reckless decisions. The Secretary of HHS also holds immense power over ensuring that women in our country have the ability to access reproductive health services, including abortion. Interestingly, I thought this was something that RFK and I agreed on. But now I'm not clear what he supports. He used to proudly say that he was pro-choice, but since being nominated, that belief seems to have disappeared overnight. The only thing I think he truly believes is in his desire to do whatever Trump wants, even if it means compromising his own values. Women in this country need to know that the Secretary of Health and Human Services will defend our rights to access all the health care we need. But at every turn, Republicans and the Trump administration have pushed forward dangerous policies intended to threaten access to full reproductive care. They put on the Supreme Court the justices who overturned Roe v. Wade. And at the state level, they have instituted draconian abortion bans that threaten the lives of mothers. Women are literally dying from a lack of care because of these bans on our health. This is 2025. How did we get here? I remember before Roe v. Wade. I remember when hundreds of thousands of women died from back alley abortions. And are we back to that point? Everyone knows that banning abortion and making women seek dangerous options does not stop abortions. It makes them more deadly. But with RFK at the helm, that's the grim reality we face. He's not someone I trust to defend a woman's right to access reproductive health care. He is not someone I want leading Health and Human Services. Now, one of the few issues that we have some actual insight into are his views on public health. His dangerous, radical, and wrong beliefs about vaccines are well documented. Every child that gets sick or dies from a disease that could be prevented by a vaccine is a tragedy. RFK will not only undermine public confidence in vaccines, he indicated that he intends to continue to profit from anti-vaccine lawsuits. It's shameful and it's corrupt. Now, we've also heard reports that the Trump administration plans to cut as much as 50% of Health and Human Services staff and decimate the work of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The CDC is our first line of defense for public health. Most important, tracking and responding to outbreaks of diseases, not only domestically, but abroad as well. The Trump administration has already taken steps to gut our global health and aid efforts, from withdrawing from the World Health Organization to cutting the CDC and U.S. Agency for International Development. They argue that these efforts are wasteful and unnecessary. But just last Friday, we were notified in New Hampshire that we had only the third confirmed case ever in the U.S. of Clade 1 monkeypox, or Mpox. The case is travel-related, meaning the patient caught the disease abroad and brought it home. Sadly, these diseases don't just stop at countries' borders. They don't just happen overseas. They affect us here at home. The Trump administration's efforts to eliminate our public health infrastructure doesn't make America safer. It doesn't make America stronger. and it doesn't make America more prosperous. It does the exact opposite. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is complicit. He's complicit in these efforts, and he will only continue them should he be confirmed. America deserves a leader at HHS who values science, who protects public health, who defends women's rights to reproductive care, to the full range of reproductive care, and who upholds the integrity of our country's core health systems. RFK Jr. has shown time and again that he is not that leader. His dangerous rhetoric on vaccines, his reckless plans to gut critical agencies, and lack of understanding of basic health care make him uniquely unqualified to advance the well-being of all Americans. I urge my colleagues to reject his nomination for Secretary of Health and Human Services. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. President. President,
the senator from New Hampshire.
I yield 30 minutes of post-cloture debate time to the Democratic leader.
The senator has that right. The senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I rise today in opposition to Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s nomination to serve as Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, also known as HHS. Throughout his entire nomination process, it has become clear that Mr. Kennedy, as well as protecting the health of all Americans. If confirmed as Secretary, he would be tasked with managing programs that millions of Americans depend on each and every day, including Medicaid and Medicare, the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC, the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, as well as a number of other initiatives aimed at medical emergencies. In total, HHS has nearly $2 trillion budget and manages more than 90,000 employees. HHS is an extremely complex organization that requires a leader with expertise on how these critically important programs are actually administered. Yet, during his hearings before the Senate Finance and Health Committees, Mr. Kennedy showed his severe lack of knowledge and understanding about the most basic of federal health programs. Mr. Kennedy could not answer the most basic questions about how the Medicaid program works or how it benefits more than 70 million Americans who depend on health insurance. At a time cuts to billionaires, we need a secretary who will not only knows how the program works, but will protect the access to health care services it provides for children and some of the most vulnerable people in our country. It's very clear Robert Kennedy Jr. is not that secretary. During his nomination process, Mr. Kennedy also made it clear he does not understand the differences between the various components of Medicare, a program that keeps our seniors cared for well into their golden years and often plays a key role in a person's decision about whether or not they can retire with dignity. Amid ongoing threats from Republicans to privatize Medicare, we need a secretary who will protect this program that generations of seniors have counted on to get care and generations to come that are paying into that fund for their future. Mr. Kennedy's lack of experience and basic understanding of our nation's healthcare system is, to say the least, extremely alarming. Confirm a nominee who doesn't even know the most basic answers about programs that he's actually in charge of administering. Since Mr. Kennedy was nominated to lead HHS, I've heard from thousands of my constituents from every corner of Michigan, from densely populated cities to some of the most rural areas in our state, who are deeply concerned about his plans for the department would impact families. For example, I've heard from countless folks about the rising cost of health care that is squeezing Michigan families' budgets. Health care prices are rising faster than inflation, making it even harder for people to get the care that they need. I've heard from a constituent who has operated a food pantry in her community for 13 years. She worries about what will happen to the people that she serves if they do not have access to the food security programs made possible by HHS. In her letter, she shared that most of her people in her pantry services are literally one ER visit or one car breakdown away from being able to feed themselves or their families. Public health initiatives are a lifeline for so many in Michigan as well as across our country. When our neighbors have access to basic health resources, it allows them to focus on improving their lives, whether that's gaining meaningful employment or getting an education. So we need an HHS secretary who is focused on improving access to Medicaid and expanding the premium tax credits for the Affordable Care Act that allows millions of Americans to access affordable health care. That clearly is not Robert Kennedy. He would not be that secretary. Instead, he believes that Americans would rather be privatized for-profit care. HHS is also in charge of providing mental health services and support to communities all across our country. Unfortunately, we have a mental health crisis impacting Americans today, with record high levels of mental illness and suicides, especially among our youth. I received a letter from a social worker in Michigan who helps students who were traumatized by the horrific shootings at Oxford High School in Michigan and at Michigan State University. She is worried that without proper mental health resources, Americans who have been impacted by senseless gun violence, whether at school, at their places of worship, at nightclubs, or at shopping malls, they will grieve and struggle alone. Unfortunately, Mr. Kennedy has only further stigmatized these important resources, even making comments during his confirmation hearing linking an increase in school shootings to an increased use of antidepressants. Mr. Kennedy's ideas would only worsen the mental health crisis that we're seeing today. Instead, we need a secretary who will invest in SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. We need a secretary who will ensure that everyone has access to the programs and health professionals needed to address this mental health crisis. Robert Kennedy Jr. is not that secretary. HHS oversees our nation's major medical research, helping to advance breakthroughs in science and development of new treatments for deadly diseases from childhood cancers to Alzheimer's. Research institutions across my home state of Michigan are conducting critically important research to improve health outcomes for Americans who suffer from these diseases. A Michigan scientist who specializes in CDC research contacted my office. They fear that if Mr. Kennedy is confirmed, it could impact their ability and the ability of thousands of researchers all across our country to conduct medical research that is literally saving lives. In a matter of weeks, we have already seen the Trump administration freeze funding the country. We need a secretary who will fight to do this important research moving forward. Research to cure cancer, to treat deadly viruses, and to address cardiovascular disease. Mr. Kennedy is not that secretary. Advancing medical research is especially important today as we face increased cases of vaccine-preventable infectious diseases like measles. And despite this, Mr. Kennedy has time and time again sown doubt and promoted dangerous lies about the safety of vaccines. And my constituents are alarmed at what that will mean for their families. A concerned mother wrote me in my office that when she was 38 weeks pregnant and told me that Mr. Kennedy's long history of spreading dangerous medical disinformation and undermining public health initiatives is directly at odds with how she plans to keep her future child from infectious disease. I also heard from a constituent who was born before the polio vaccine was approved. She said that to this day, she can still remember the relief on her mother's face when the polio vaccine became available. This moment has stuck with her throughout her 30-year career as a registered nurse, where she has made it her life's work to study and safely administer vaccines in her community. And let's be clear, let's be absolutely clear. Vaccines are scientifically proven to protect against diseases like chickenpox, polio, influenza, and yes, COVID-19. We have eradicated deadly diseases and protected our children due to incredible scientific advances in vaccine research. But now, vaccine skeptics like Mr. Kennedy have risen to prominence, discouraging people from getting safe, proven vaccines and putting every American's health at risk when it comes to infectious diseases. We need a secretary who understands the effectiveness of vaccines and will do more to prevent these diseases through routine childhood immunizations. Mr. Kennedy is not that secretary. And if confirmed, Mr. Kennedy has made it perfectly clear that he will stand in direct opposition to this evidence-based medicine. Mr. Kennedy's falsehood about basic public health practices have impacts that stretch far beyond our physical health. Another constituent, a clinical therapist, said she is seeing firsthand the devastating impacts that misinformation can have on mental health, adherence to treatment, and overall patient well-being. Specifically, she mentioned that the spread of falsehoods about vaccines, psychiatric care, and medical disease and hinders efforts to connect patients with effective evidence-based. We're concerned about Mr. Kennedy's narrative suggesting vaccines cause autism. Because he has given credibility to these lies and questioned facts from scientists and doctors, these parents worry that their children will not receive the most basic routine care that they deserve. And in the midst of so many healthcare challenges, from prescription drugs to mental health to various public health threats, we cannot afford to have someone as unprepared as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in charge of all these public health agencies. Even well-respected organizations know that Mr. Kennedy would be an absolute disaster for our public health. Take the American Public Health Association, for example. And in a letter, they said, quote, "To effectively lead our nation's top health agency, a candidate should ideally be trained in health administration, clinical care, or a related field, and must believe in and follow the scientific evidence that serves as the basics of our nation's system to protect and to promote the public health from all the threats that we face." End of quote. We simply cannot afford to have someone as unqualified as Robert Kennedy Jr. to be in charge of our top public health agency. He has failed to exhibit even the most basic knowledge of how HHS programs are administered to the millions of Americans who depend on them each and every day. He has misrepresented scientific evidence that is at the foundation of what HHS sets out to accomplish, which is keeping Americans healthy and protected from disease. He has demonized doctors, scientists, researchers, and medical professionals who, unlike him, have actually done the important work to keep our communities safe. I urge my colleagues to judge Mr. Kennedy on his lack of qualifications. It is clear he simply does not have the expertise, the training, or even the leadership skills necessary to lead a department as important as HHS. We need a secretary who will protect the health of Americans. Robert Kennedy is not that secretary. And if he is confirmed to lead the Department of Health and Human Services, the American people will ultimately pay the price with their health. I urge my colleagues to join me in voting no.
Mr. President.
The senator from New Mexico.
Mr. President, just over 5 years ago, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. traveled to the Pacific island of Samoa. Mr. Kennedy was on a mission to spread baseless and debunked conspiracy theories about the safety and efficacy of children's vaccines. Trading in his esteemed family name and peddling himself as some sort of expert, Mr. Kennedy discouraged parents in Samoa from vaccinating their children. The impact of Mr. Kennedy's visit was undeniable. Health providers in Samoa reported that anti-vaccine voices got louder after his visit, and the rate of measles vaccinations for eligible 1-year-olds in Samoa fell to under 33%, well below herd immunity. 5 months after Mr. Kennedy's visit, Samoa had a massive measles outbreak, with 5,000 of its citizens contracting the disease and 83 Samoans dying, the vast majority of which were children under the age of 5. During his recent Senate confirmation hearings, Mr. Kennedy doubled down on his denialism, claiming that, quote, "We don't know what was killing those children in Samoa." Mr. Kennedy also claimed in written responses to Senate questions that my words had nothing to do with vaccine uptake in Samoa or with the 2019 epidemic. But the current top health official in Samoa has denounced Mr. Kennedy's characterization of the measles outbreak in his country and Mr. Kennedy's role in it as an outright lie and a total fabrication. As someone with a background in science, but more importantly, just as a father of 2 young men, I am horrified by this story. The measles vaccine has been one of the most successful public health and science stories of the last century. One vaccine, administered in 2 doses, now provides protection against 4 devastating diseases: measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox. In the late 1950s and early 60s, nearly twice as many young people died from measles as from polio. And thanks to incredible scientific research and medical advances, we now have a vaccine that is proven to be safe and effective at protecting our kids from these deadly diseases. This vaccine has largely eradicated the measles outbreaks that used to result in the devastating loss of babies and young children. That is, until anti-vaccine crusaders like Mr. Kennedy started promoting phony science and conspiracy theories in places like Samoa. Over the last 2 decades, thanks in large part to Mr. Kennedy, this anti-science movement has moved from the darkest corners of the internet into the mainstream.